Before America understood what organized crime truly was, before the headlines screamed his name, before prosecutors labeled him the architect of modern vice, Lucky Luciano stood quietly at the center of an empire no one realized existed. Not yet. Not fully. Not until it was too late. Picture him in the early 1930s. A well-dressed silhouette against the glow of Manhattan nightlife, cigarette smoke drifting past his face as he surveys a city pulsing with money, ambition, and opportunity. To the outside world, he is simply another stylish gangster in a tailored suit. But look closer, and the truth becomes unmistakable. This is not a street thug. This is the mind behind a hidden economy. Luciano saw New York not as a map of neighborhoods and rival gangs, but as a web of possibilities, a machine waiting to be redesigned. While others fought for corners, Luciano saw entire industries. While rivals clung to old traditions, he quietly planned a future where crime would function like a corporation, complete with structure, departments, divisions, and national reach. It was an empire built in plain sight, yet invisible to anyone who didn't understand the psychology behind it. A new kind of criminal mind. The question that haunts historians, law enforcement, and storytellers is simple. How did one man transform scattered street crimes into a unified underworld worth millions, eventually billions? The answer begins with Luciano's mind. He wasn't the strongest gangster. He wasn't the most brutal. He wasn't even the loudest voice in a room. Luciano's power came from his ability to read people, their fears, motives, loyalties, and hidden weaknesses. He understood human nature with a precision that made him not just a leader but a strategist. He could sense when alliances were fragile, when rivalries could be manipulated, when violence was necessary, and when silence was more effective than a bullet. Where others reacted, Luciano calculated. And through those calculations he reshaped the criminal world. America before the empire. In the years before his rise, the American underworld was chaos, scattered gangs, ethnic rivalries, disorganized operations, and endless street wars. Bootlegging brought money but also bloodshed. Prostitution brought profit but little structure. Gambling was everywhere but unpredictable. There was no system, no order, no overarching vision. Luciano changed that. He saw the potential of unifying operations, linking cities, and creating a national network where crime flowed like commerce. The old bosses were guardians of tradition, but Luciano became something else entirely, a criminal industrialist. A shadow economy takes form. What he built was more than a mafia. It was a multi-layered shadow economy. Every racket, gambling, narcotics, extortion, prostitution, became a department. Every territory became a district. Every family became a branch. Money moved like veins through a body, each controlled by rules, meetings, and silent agreements enforced not by superstition, but by strategy. When Luciano looked at New York, he didn't see danger. He saw data. He saw patterns. He saw opportunity where others saw threats. And from those insights, he constructed an empire that governments would spend decades trying to dismantle. A man hidden behind a myth. The world would eventually know him as the father of modern organized crime. But in these early moments, before the trials, before the exile, before the legend overshadowed the man, Luciano operated from the shadows with a kind of brilliance that felt almost invisible. He walked into meetings quietly and left with entire territories reorganized. He resolved conflicts others thought impossible. He built alliances across ethnic boundaries that had been deadly for years. He replaced fear with structure, chaos with order, violence with design. He was not the king the underworld expected. He was the king it didn't realize it needed. The story begins in the shadows. This documentary begins not with violence, but with vision. Not with bloodshed, but with the birth of a system. This is the story of how a young immigrant with nothing carved out a criminal empire that reshaped America, and how that empire rose, thrived, and ultimately turned against him. It is the story of a man whose mind became more powerful than any gun, whose decisions built an underground economy that outlived him, and whose shadow still stretches across modern organized crime. This is the empire no one saw coming, and the man who saw it long before anyone else even knew it existed. Before Lucky Luciano reshaped the American underworld into a disciplined empire, New York in the early 1900s was a battleground of disorganization, a grimy mosaic of hustlers, bootleggers, and small-time gangsters clawing for survival one street corner at a time. Crime existed, yes, but not as an industry. It was a chaotic ecosystem with no structure, no strategy, and no unifying vision. Every neighborhood had its own rules. Every gang had its own grudges. Every decision was driven by impulse rather than planning. It was a world badly in need of an architect. But no one knew that yet. A city of fragmented hustles. The underworld of early New York wasn't a cohesive network. It was a collection of desperate ventures. Bootleggers smuggled whiskey across rivers and alleys, each crew inventing its own methods, none connected to the others. One gang might use hidden truck compartments. Another relied on corrupt dockworkers. Another trusted sheer luck and reckless speed. These were not operations. They were improvisations. Money slipped through fingers as quickly as liquor spilled across tenement floors. Violence was frequent, but profit was inconsistent. No one trusted anyone outside their immediate circle. Every dollar came with risk. Every deal came with betrayal. And yet, beneath the chaos, opportunity churned like an engine waiting for the right hands to control it. Gangsters fighting over scraps. The gangs of this era fought not for empires, but for survival. Street corners became territories. Bars became battlegrounds. Petty disputes spiraled into bloody feuds that lasted generations. Instead of building something larger, crews wasted their strength battling over crumbs. The 5 Points gang fought with the Eastmans. The Wyos brawled with newcomers. Italian, Irish, and Jewish gangs clashed out of instinct, not strategy. Violence was the only language they spoke fluently, and even that was undisciplined. A drunken insult could trigger a stabbing. A lost bet could spark a street war. Guns were tools, not tactics. It was crime without vision. The Sicilian shadow, old world customs. Beneath the street-level chaos lurked another kind of limitation. The old world mafia traditions carried from Sicily. Their customs were rigid, rooted in village hierarchies and built for rural power struggles, not the sprawling complexity of New York City. Their rules demanded loyalty to bloodline, secrecy above innovation, obedience over intelligence, revenge over resolution. These traditions were sacred, but they were also suffocating. The old bosses clung to rituals that made sense on Italian farms but collapsed in American cities filled with immigrants, opportunity, and rapid economic change. The Sicilian Mafia in New York was strong in myth, but weak in adaptation. It could intimidate, but it could not organize. It could punish, but it could not scale. It could wage vendettas, but it could not build industries. The old world simply didn't fit the new one. Bootlegging breaks the system open. When Prohibition arrived, the underworld exploded with opportunity, but the lack of structure turned opportunity into chaos. Liquor distribution became a gold rush with no rules. Everyone wanted in. Everyone competed. Everyone betrayed one another for a bigger share. Rival crews hijacked shipments. Informants swapped sides weekly. Politicians took bribes from multiple gangs without loyalty to any. Money poured in, but so did blood. Prohibition was a door to fortune, but only for someone who could organize the chaos behind it. And at this point, no one in the underworld had the mind or vision to do so. A system waiting for a mastermind. Even law enforcement, overwhelmed by the scale of illegal activity, noted the absurd disorganization of the criminal world. They weren't challenged by a unified enemy. They were exhausted by 100 uncoordinated ones. If criminals ever learned to cooperate, the police warned, the result would be catastrophic. No one listened. No one imagined such cooperation was possible. But somewhere in the Lower East Side, a young immigrant named Salvatore Lucania was watching, carefully, quietly, learning from every mistake, every feud, every shattered alliance. He studied the city not as a cluster of gangs but as a living system. He saw the inefficiencies others overlooked. He saw the money slipping through cracks no one bothered to seal. He saw the chaos not as a barrier but as an opportunity. Where others saw disorder, he saw design waiting to be built. The need for an architect. Everything about early 20th century crime screamed for structure. The scattered bootleggers needed standardized routes. The gangs needed boundaries and rules. The mafia needed modernization and leadership. The rackets needed consistency and cooperation. Crime had potential. But potential without planning is waste. Luciano would one day bring the blueprint, transforming petty hustles into national enterprises, fractious gangs into organized families, and chaotic street crime into a billion-dollar shadow economy. But before any of that could happen, there had to be a world broken enough to reveal what it lacked. And this was that world, a world of scraps, feuds, and improvisations. A world waiting for the man who could turn fragments into a fortune. Long before Lucky Luciano became the architect of American organized crime, he was simply Salvatore Lucania, a young immigrant boy stepping into the chaos of New York's Lower East Side, a world overflowing with noise, hunger, and danger. It was here, in cramped tenements and violent streets, that Luciano learned the first truths that would shape his empire. Survival is a skill, opportunity hides in chaos, and power belongs to those who understand people better than anyone else. A childhood carved by poverty. The Lucania family arrived in America with hope, but reality struck fast. The Lower East Side was a collision of cultures, smells, languages, fights, and desperation. Salvatore watched adults bargain for pennies, children steal food, landlords prey on the vulnerable, and police ignore entire neighborhoods unless a bribe was involved. Nothing about this world was gentle. Nothing came without struggle. Poverty sharpened his senses. He learned to spot danger before it approached. He learned which adults to trust and which to avoid. He learned that every resource, food, shelter, safety, had a price. Most importantly, he learned to rely on his mind, not his fists. The early hustler emerges. School felt like a cage. The streets felt like opportunity. Salvatore became a messenger, a dice player, a lookout, any job that taught him the rhythms of the city. He watched how small exchanges led to larger ones, how favors created leverage, and how loyalty could be bought just as easily as fear. He wasn't chasing wealth yet. He was chasing control. In a world that pushed immigrants to the bottom, he refused to stay there. He understood early that the world was divided into those who adapted, and those who were crushed. He chose adaptation. The first education. Young Luciano developed an instinct that would become his greatest power, the ability to read people. He watched the tension in a man's shoulders, the flicker of hesitation in someone's eyes, the dishonest smile of someone selling false promises. He learned who bluffed, who panicked, who lied, who could be trusted and who couldn't. He understood motives long before he understood money. This early psychological awareness became the foundation of his future rule. Before he built an empire, he built understanding. Meeting Meyer Lansky, the missing half of the mind. If the streets gave Luciano instinct, Meyer Lansky gave him discipline. The two met as teenagers on a street corner where Jewish and Italian gangs often clashed. Instead of violence, there was recognition, an immediate understanding between two sharp minds shaped by hardship. Lansky, quiet and brilliant, had mathematical precision and emotional control. Luciano had charisma, intuition, and the ability to move between worlds. Together they formed a partnership that would change history. Lansky taught Luciano the power of numbers, how gambling wasn't luck but probability, how profit required planning, how organization could defeat chaos. Luciano absorbed these lessons quickly, seeing in Lansky not just a friend but someone who understood the world with equal clarity. They didn't want scraps. They wanted systems. They wanted permanence. They wanted a future where men like them didn't scramble for pennies but shaped the entire economy of the streets. The emotional engine behind the ambition. Beneath Luciano's rising confidence lay a deeper emotional truth. He didn't just want money. Money was the language of the streets, but it wasn't the purpose. What he craved was order, a world where things made sense, where chaos could be controlled, where power was predictable. He hated the randomness of poverty, the instability of violence, the uncertainty of relying on others who didn't think ahead. He wanted respect, not from fear but from recognition. He wanted security not for survival but for dominion. He wanted permanence, something his childhood had never offered. These desires didn't make him cruel, they made him focused. Where others were content with a good day's winnings, Luciano planned for the next year. Where others saw a street, he saw a network. Where others saw gangs, he saw departments. Ambition wasn't a luxury for him, it was an emotional necessity. The first taste of power. As Luciano grew older, his reputation expanded. He became the teenager who could negotiate peace between two brawling kids, the young man who could organize a dice game without the cops showing up, the hustler who repaid debts early and remembered every slight and every loyalty. His confidence drew others in. His discipline kept them close. His strategy turned his small crew into a growing circle of influence. Lansky remained his intellectual counterpart, and together they formed an early blueprint of what future criminal organization could look like. A blend of instinct and calculation, psychology and mathematics, street sense and long-term planning. A mind evolving beyond the streets. By his late teens, Luciano was no longer just another street kid. He had become a thinker in a world that rarely rewarded thought. He watched gang leaders waste men and money on petty fights. He watched Sicilian elders cling to old traditions that made no sense in America. He watched bootleggers collapse under the weight of their own disorganization. He began to see clearly what others could not. The criminal world was broken, not from lack of strength but from lack of structure. And structure was something he understood innately. The transformation begins. Luciano's rise was not a sudden leap but a slow sharpening. Each day on the streets taught him how to control chaos. Each lesson from Lansky taught him how to refine that control. Each insult from poverty reminded him why order mattered. He was no longer just surviving. He was preparing. Because the world around him was fractured, and one day someone would need to bring it together. Someone who understood people. Someone who understood systems. Someone who had lived the chaos and learned to tame it. Someone like Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano's rise was not the story of a gangster climbing a ladder, it was the story of a visionary constructing a system. While others saw rackets, Luciano saw departments. While others saw men, he saw management tiers. While others fought for blocks, he built a nationwide criminal industry. In a world where crime had always been reactive, Luciano became the first to be proactive, the first to design rather than improvise. By the time Prohibition flooded America with opportunity, the young street hustler from the Lower East Side had already developed a mind shaped by survival and sharpened by strategy. Now he was ready to apply that mind to something far greater, a criminal empire engineered with the same precision as a modern corporation. Delegation, the first pillar of the empire in the old world mafia, a boss controlled everything personally. That meant inefficiency, inconsistency, and constant vulnerability. Luciano rejected this immediately. He believed no boss should micromanage, a boss should coordinate. His first radical idea was simple: delegate power to men who excelled in specific areas. Meyer Lansky became the architect of financial structures, turning gambling into a disciplined mathematical business. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel provided muscle and charisma, a force of nature who opened doors Luciano couldn't walk through himself. Frank Costello became the diplomat, specializing in political relationships and bribes that shaped entire industries. Vito Genovese, ruthless and ambitious, served as a trusted enforcer and administrator, though Luciano sensed the danger beneath his loyalty. Rather than rule through dominance, Luciano ruled through distribution of responsibility. Every man had a role. Every role had a purpose. Every purpose strengthened the whole. This alone separated him from every boss before him. Profit sharing, the second pillar where old bosses hoarded wealth, Luciano understood something fundamental. Men protect what they have a stake in. He instituted a profit-sharing model long before corporate executives adopted similar ideas. Lieutenants earned percentages. Crews received predictable shares. Even foot soldiers felt the financial benefit of stability. By giving men something to lose, he ensured they would fight to protect the system. Profit-sharing did more than inspire loyalty, it produced efficiency. Crews worked harder. Territories stabilized. Violence decreased because profit became the priority. Luciano wasn't buying loyalty. He was engineering it. Regional oversight. A syndicate takes shape. The operation soon grew too large for New York alone. Luciano began establishing regional overseers, trusted men who monitored entire territories and reported only to him. This created a multi-tiered structure. Local crews managed street-level operations. Capo regimes supervised districts. Lieutenants coordinated multiple districts. Underbosses handled city-wide strategy. Luciano controlled the national vision. This was the birth of the syndicate, a decentralized but unified criminal network unlike anything America had seen. It allowed Luciano to control operations in New York, New Jersey, Chicago, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and beyond, all without lifting a finger on the street. It also allowed him to disappear behind the scenes. The stronger the structure became, the less visible he needed to be. A CEO, not a gangster. Luciano's brilliance was not in violence, though he was capable of it, but in his ability to think as a businessman. He understood supply chains, bootlegging routes, distribution networks, union access, human resources, crew assignments, risk management, law enforcement strategies, market expansion, gambling and narcotics. This made him the first true CEO of organized crime. And his board of directors? Lansky, Siegel, Costello, Genovese, Adonis, Anastasia, Bonanno, each a specialist, each a regional power, each part of a system larger than any of them individually. Where older bosses ruled by ego, Luciano ruled by efficiency. Gambling, the engine of wealth. Luciano learned early that gambling was the purest form of predictable revenue. With Lansky's mathematical genius, they standardized games, regulated payouts, and eliminated cheating, something unheard of in illegal casinos. This consistency attracted high-paying customers and minimized police attention. Their gambling operations extended from Harlem to Miami, from Newark to New Orleans. Money flowed upward through the syndicate with the reliability of a corporate dividend. Bootlegging, the opportunity of a century. Prohibition created chaos for most bootleggers. But for Luciano, it offered a landscape ready for organization. He partnered with Jewish and Irish gangs, breaking the ethnic barriers that had crippled the underworld for decades. He coordinated shipments, negotiated truces and prevented overlapping territory. The profits were unprecedented. The alliances were revolutionary. From bootlegging came the first major portion of Luciano's hidden fortune, wealth that no taxman, no detective, and no rival could trace. Unions, the power behind the curtain. Luciano understood that real power did not come from violence but from influence. Control the docks and you control shipping. Control the unions and you control labor. Control labor and you control industry. With Costello's political finesse, Luciano infiltrated unions quietly. They didn't overthrow leaders, they replaced them subtly. Suddenly, the syndicate had leverage over construction, transportation, and manufacturing. It was the closest thing America had ever seen to a shadow government. Narcotics. The calculated risk. Luciano approached narcotics with caution, aware of the severe legal consequences. But he also recognized its profitability. With Genovese pushing aggressively, Luciano allowed limited, controlled involvement, enough to expand revenue streams, not enough to bring unwanted federal heat. It was a risk. But it was a controlled risk, and it contributed to his growing, almost mythical wealth. The hidden fortune begins to take shape by the early 1930s. Luciano's income came from gambling, bootlegging, unions, protection, rackets, prostitution, narcotics, interstate partnerships, political connections. Money flowed in so many directions that even he couldn't always track it. But he knew one thing: the structure he created would make him wealthy beyond measure, and untouchable if it held. Every dollar was a brick in the hidden empire. Every alliance was a scaffold. Every decision built toward something larger than any gangster had ever imagined. Lucky Luciano was no longer building a gang. He was building an industry, a criminal empire so modern, so structured, so efficient that America would spend the next century trying to understand how one man engineered it. Long before Lucky Luciano transformed the Mafia into a national criminal industry, one rule governed the old world underworld: omerta, the code of silence. For most Sicilian immigrants, it was a cultural inheritance, a way of surviving oppression and mistrust in the old country. But for Luciano, omerta became something far more strategic: a risk management system, a stabilizer for profit, and the backbone of the largest shadow corporation America had ever seen. Silence was no longer just honor. It became infrastructure. The old world meaning of omerta in Sicily, omerta had been survival. It meant never speaking to authorities, never revealing family secrets, never accusing another man, even if doing so cost your life. It preserved dignity in a land ruled by foreign powers and corrupt officials. It kept communities united against outside threats. But those traditions, sacred as they were, had flaws. They created rigid hierarchies, fueled endless vendettas, and hindered innovation. In America, these flaws were magnified. The old bosses clung to omerta as a religious commandment, using it to maintain control rather than create opportunity. Luciano respected the roots of the code, but he saw its limitations. He also saw its untapped potential. Luciano's interpretation: silence as strategy. Where old dons used omerta to enforce obedience, Luciano used it to enforce efficiency. Secrecy became less about honor and more about risk reduction. Loose talk didn't just insult tradition, it jeopardized profit. He implemented omerta as a security protocol, a corporate policy, a psychological filter, and a financial safeguard. Information was no longer shared casually. It flowed upward and downward like a controlled pipeline, compartmentalized so that no man knew more than he needed. If one part of the structure was compromised, the other parts remained intact. This model mirrored the compartmentalization used by global intelligence agencies, except Luciano did it first. Reducing leaks. The operational genius Luciano understood the greatest threat to criminal industry wasn't rival gangs or even law enforcement, it was information leakage. A frightened soldier, a careless lieutenant, or a jealous rival could unravel years of planning. So he redesigned the communication system. Street soldiers only knew their immediate superior. Capo regimes knew their crews but not high-level strategy. Underbosses knew the operational map, not the financial structure. Only Luciano and a select few understood the full architecture. No one could betray what they did not know. Silence protected money, stability, and, most critically, leadership continuity. Omerta as a loyalty mechanism. Luciano saw something profound. Men who felt valued became loyal. Loyal men stayed silent. So silence became a rewarded behavior, not just a demanded one. Through profit sharing, predictable income, and structured roles, Luciano turned omerta into a financial incentive. Breaking the code didn't just risk death, it risked losing a reliable, profitable career inside a functioning criminal corporation. Men stayed loyal because it made them wealthy. They stayed silent because silence protected their wealth. In this system, morality mattered less than mutual benefit. The moral contradiction here lay the heart of Luciano's empire, a contradiction that haunted the underworld for decades. He built a system that promised security through a culture that thrived on fear. Omerta protected men, but it also imprisoned them. It stabilized leadership, but it eliminated dissent. It reduced risk, but only through the constant threat of violent enforcement. Luciano used psychology rather than brutality whenever possible, but he never hesitated to apply force when silence broke. Control required consequence. Fear was the shadow behind every rule, necessary, brutal, effective. His empire was built on cooperation in the boardroom and intimidation in the basement. Omerta as corporate governance. Luciano's innovation was not in inventing Omerta, but in elevating it to a managerial system. He used it to prevent disputes from escalating, ensure internal discipline, protect cross-ethnic alliances, streamline operations, keep leaders accountable. Silence became the glue that held together multi-ethnic partnerships with Jewish, Irish, and Italian figures. Without it, the alliances would have collapsed under cultural mistrust. But Luciano enforced Omerta across all his partnerships, giving them a shared rule that transcended heritage. It became the universal language of trust. The human cost of silence. But silence shapes men in unseen ways. Soldiers hid fear behind stoic expressions. Lieutenants carried secrets they could never share with family. Friends suspected betrayal when someone went quiet for too long. Luciano built stability, but at the cost of emotional isolation. He created security but not peace. Even he lived in a world where no one spoke freely, where every conversation had layers, codes, and consequences. The deeper the silence, the heavier the crown. Silence as the foundation of fortune. By enforcing Omerta as a business tool, Luciano created predictable income streams, reduced legal exposure, stabilized rank structures, minimized informant risk, maximized longevity. This allowed his empire to flourish quietly beneath the surface of American society. Politicians took bribes without fear. Judges made deals through intermediaries. Businessmen partnered with mob figures discreetly. The quieter the mafia operated, the louder its profits grew. Luciano understood better than anyone. A secret shared among 10 men is fragile. A secret known by 2 is manageable. A secret kept by 1 is unbreakable. And so he built a system where only he understood everything, creating an empire whose fortune depended on his ability to listen, to observe, and above all, to stay silent. The paradox at the heart of his empire. In the end, Omerta gave Luciano everything: discipline, loyalty, safety, fortune, but it also planted the seeds of something darker. Paranoia, hidden betrayals, suppressed truths, loneliness. Silence protected the empire, but silence also hid the cracks forming beneath it. Luciano had created a world where secrecy was law and fear was order. A world where men prospered in shadows. A world where the quietest voice held the greatest power. Omerta was not just the mafia's code. It was Luciano's masterpiece, and the foundation of the hidden fortune that would shape his destiny and ultimately contribute to his downfall. To understand Lucky Luciano's hidden fortune, one must understand the simple truth that defined his empire. Crime was not chaos, it was commerce. Where old bosses saw isolated rackets, Luciano saw interconnected revenue streams. He viewed the underworld as a marketplace, each vice a product line, each territory a distribution zone, each man a moving part in a larger economic machine. This was not criminal activity. It was underground capitalism, quiet, efficient, and engineered for scale. Luciano dissected every major illegal industry and rebuilt it with business logic. By the early 1930s, he had transformed prostitution, gambling, narcotics, and labor racketeering into stable, predictable income engines. Each venture generated money that didn't exist on paper yet flowed through American cities like an invisible river, pooling into Luciano's hands. Prostitution, the standardized industry before Luciano. Prostitution in New York was chaotic, violent, and unreliable. Madams competed viciously, pimps worked independently, and profits evaporated through infighting. Luciano saw inefficiency everywhere. So he industrialized it. His system introduced standardized earnings. Every brothel paid a fixed percentage upward. Territorial licensing. Operations were approved, regulated, and protected. Reliable security. Siegel's men enforced order and prevented rogue operators. Centralized oversight. A managerial structure monitored daily revenue. The innovation was shocking for its time. Prostitutes were no longer shuffled dangerously between pimps. Madams followed rules. Collectors followed routes. Corrupt officers knew exactly whom to contact. Luciano didn't invent the trade. He optimized it. And through that optimization poured a consistent stream of cash, quiet, constant, and nearly impossible for law enforcement to track. Gambling, from corner bets to organized revenue gambling, was the heartbeat of Luciano's financial empire. Street numbers, dice games, card rooms, and off-the-books casinos had always existed, but they were fragmented and vulnerable. With Meyer Lansky, Luciano built a network instead of a patchwork. Together they created protected casinos with predictable profit cycles, standardized payouts that attracted wealthier clientele, mathematical controls to minimize house losses, multi-city collaborations that moved money discreetly. Lansky brought the numbers. Luciano brought the muscle. Their partnership turned gambling into one of the most stable and profitable engines of organized crime. Street numbers, once a neighborhood hustle, became a citywide lottery. Casinos, once dingy rooms, became polished enterprises. Protection rackets, once primitive, became organized insurance systems. Every chip, every roll, every bet contributed to Luciano's hidden fortune. Narcotics. The early international pipeline. Luciano approached narcotics with caution, but also with vision. He understood the profit margins were astronomical, far beyond prostitution or gambling, but the risks were equally high. Still, he was one of the first American mobsters to recognize the potential of an international supply chain. Using connections in Marseille, Sicily, Havana, North Africa, Luciano helped establish early heroin pipelines into the United States. Distribution was limited, kept quiet, compartmentalized, and controlled by trusted lieutenants like Vito Genovese. Luciano's brilliance was not in how much he moved, but how carefully he scaled the operation. He kept distances between suppliers, distributors, and street-level dealers. He avoided flashy profits. He ensured no one man had enough information to expose the entire chain. Narcotics didn't define his empire, but it added a powerful current to his underground wealth. Labor racketeering. Monetizing America's workforce. Perhaps Luciano's most sophisticated revenue stream was labor racketeering. He understood something few gangsters considered. Unions controlled labor and labor controlled industry. Whoever influenced unions could influence money across entire cities. With Frank Costello's political finesse, Luciano infiltrated dockworkers unions, construction unions, trucking and transport unions, garment and manufacturing unions. This gave the syndicate unprecedented control over shipping schedules, cargo allocation, construction costs, strike timings, labor negotiations. Companies paid to avoid sabotage. Others paid to receive cooperation. Some paid simply because refusing wasn't an option. Luciano didn't rely on brute force. He relied on leverage. Labor racketeering produced not only enormous profits but also enormous power. It embedded Luciano into the legitimate economy, a shadow partner in industries that shaped American infrastructure. Protection and corruption. Invisible revenue. Luciano also monetized protection with corporate precision. Business owners paid fees not just to stay safe but to stay operational. He reduced arbitrary violence and replaced it with predictable payments. Corruption followed the same logic. Judges, police captains, inspectors, and politicians all had price tags. Luciano kept meticulous boundaries. No official was overpaid, no bribe too extravagant, no scandal allowed to flare. Corruption wasn't chaos. It was a controlled budget line. Multi-tiered revenue, a hidden fortune in motion. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's wealth did not sit in safes or bank accounts. It moved, constantly, invisibly, through casino chips, through brothel earnings, through union dues, through narcotics shipments, through protection money, through political contributions, through interstate partnerships. This circulation made the fortune impossible to measure and nearly impossible to stop. It wasn't a pile of money. It was a living ecosystem. The genius behind the system. Luciano didn't create new crimes. He created new methods. He turned vice into supply chains, chaos into workflow, criminals into departments, rackets into industries. He built a syndicate that thrived not on brutality, but on continuity, a system so modern that analysts today still compare it to Fortune 500 structures. Money flowed because he engineered it to flow. Silence held because he engineered it to hold. Loyalty remained because profit demanded it. The fortune that never existed on paper. When prosecutors later asked how much Luciano was truly worth, the answer was untraceable. His empire existed in cash, in cooperation, in the pockets of politicians, and in the shadows of businesses that legally employed thousands. His wealth was both everywhere and nowhere. A river beneath America's surface, unseen, unstoppable. Lucky Luciano didn't just make money. He industrialized vice, turned crime into commerce, and crafted a hidden fortune that defined the underworld long after his reign was over. Every empire rises on the strength of its alliances, and trembles under the weight of its enemies. But in Lucky Luciano's world, allies and enemies were often the same men, shifting from asset to liability with a single reckless decision. His syndicate may have looked like a corporation, but the people inside it were still gangsters driven by ego, fear, and ambition. Luciano's genius was not just in building systems, it was in managing personalities, the volatile human engines powering his criminal industry. Nowhere was this more apparent than in his relationships with Dutch Schultz, Salvatore Maranzano, and Vito Genovese, three men whose ambitions and flaws threatened everything Luciano was trying to build. Dutch Schultz, the liability of chaos. Dutch Schultz was a money machine. His bootlegging and numbers rackets brought in staggering profits, and his network covered vast stretches of New York. In pure revenue he was a dream partner. But Luciano didn't measure value in dollars alone. He measured it in stability. Schultz was the opposite of stable. He was paranoid, impulsive, and dangerously emotional. Where Luciano calculated, Schultz reacted. Where Luciano negotiated, Schultz threatened. Where Luciano built alliances, Schultz incinerated them. Luciano respected his earning power but feared his unpredictability. Schultz's men beat competitors instead of negotiating with them. They killed too quickly, too loudly. They drew police heat like moths draw fire. The breaking point came when Schultz fixated on killing prosecutor Thomas Dewey. To Schultz, Dewey was a personal enemy. To Luciano, Dewey was a federal spotlight that no rational businessman dared provoke. When Luciano tried to reason with him, Schultz mocked the idea of restraint. He didn't care about industry, about the commission, about long-term profit. He wanted revenge, and revenge threatened everything the syndicate had built. Schultz wasn't just a reckless ally. He was a financial risk. An uncontrolled variable inside a system built on control. Luciano had only two choices: contain him, or eliminate him. Salvatore Maranzano, the tyrant in a modern world. If Schultz represented chaos, Salvatore Maranzano represented rigidity, the kind of old-world thinking Luciano had spent years trying to rise above. After Masuria's fall, Maranzano saw himself as the rightful boss of all bosses, a monarch ruling over every Italian criminal in America. He admired Luciano's intelligence but saw him as a tool, not a partner. Maranzano wanted obedience, not collaboration, hierarchy, not innovation. Luciano's business vision clashed instantly with Maranzano's medieval mentality. Where Luciano saw profit-sharing, cross-ethnic alliances, decentralized leadership, corporate structure, Maranzano saw weakness, heresy, and American corruption. He reorganized the Mafia into families, an idea Luciano supported, but then demanded tribute and submission. He lectured on Roman emperors and expected loyalty based on cultural tradition, not economic logic. For Luciano, this was catastrophic thinking. The future required flexibility. Maranzano offered chains. When Maranzano began secretly plotting Luciano's death, hiring assassins, gathering intelligence, preparing a purge, the contradiction became fatal. Luciano couldn't build the modern mafia under a man who wanted to resurrect the old one. Like Schultz, Maranzano became a threat to structure, a liability disguised as leadership. Luciano had to choose between protecting the corporate model he created or bowing to a king whose ambition would destroy it. He made the only choice a strategist could. Vito Genovese. The threat within. If Schultz was chaos and Maranzano was rigidity, Vito Genovese was something far more dangerous. Ambition in the shadows. Genovese was brilliant, ruthless, and patient. He admired Luciano, studied him, learned from him, and envied him. Luciano saw Genovese's potential and used it, but he also sensed the danger. Genovese wasn't reckless like Schultz. He wasn't outdated like Maranzano. He was strategic, a man who wanted the top seat and understood exactly what it took to get there. Inside the syndicate, Genovese's jealousy simmered quietly. He handled violence efficiently, negotiations effectively, and operations skillfully. But each success fueled a belief that the empire Luciano built should eventually belong to him. Luciano tried to manage him the way a CEO handles a talented but power-hungry executive, with trust, proximity, and limited responsibility. But Genovese hungered for more. He wanted authority, recognition, and ultimately the crown Luciano refused to wear. The greatest challenge was that Genovese was useful, too useful to discard. Removing him would fracture the organization. Keeping him meant constantly monitoring a threat that lived inside the structure itself. Genovese wasn't an enemy. He was a future problem growing stronger every year. Managing a mafia like a corporation, Luciano managed these personalities with the precision of a corporate strategist. With Schultz, he minimized risk through alliances, persuasion, and eventually decisive action. With Maranzano, he identified an outdated leader obstructing growth and replaced him, just as any modern corporation might remove a CEO who stifles innovation. With Genovese, he applied containment, using him where needed, watching him everywhere else. Profit became the measuring stick. Loyalty became currency. Threat assessment became policy. Luciano didn't play the underworld like a battlefield. He played it like a boardroom, where every man was an asset, a liability, or both. The tension between loyalty and profit. Luciano believed loyalty mattered, but profit mattered more. He trusted men only as long as their goals aligned with the organization. When Schultz's revenge threatened business, he acted. When Maranzano's ambition threatened structure, he acted. When Genovese's jealousy threatened leadership, he monitored, waited, calculated. The triumvirate of trouble surrounding him, chaos, tradition, ambition, forced Luciano into the role that would define his legacy. The man who balanced the criminal world like an economy. The quiet lesson beneath it all in managing allies who could become enemies, and enemies who masqueraded as allies, Luciano learned the unavoidable truth that shaped his empire. Business and betrayal were inseparable. Profit and danger were twins. And every man in the syndicate was capable of becoming both asset and threat. Luciano built the Mafia into an industry, but he built it while standing on a fault line that shifted every time one of his allies changed ambition. Before historians named it the Castellamarese War, the men who lived through it understood it as something far simpler: survival. But for Lucky Luciano, it was more than survival. It was a test of whether he could protect the growing financial empire he'd built. An empire that depended on stability, silence, and structure at a time when every street corner felt like a battlefield. The war between Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano was not just a feud for control of New York's Mafia. It was a conflict that threatened to destroy every revenue stream Luciano had carefully engineered. Every assassination attempt, every betrayal, every shifting alliance threatened to fracture the delicate machinery of his criminal industry. Prohibition money was pouring in, but money meant nothing if the networks that produced it were shattered by chaos. Luciano knew he was walking through a violent storm. He also knew he could not allow that storm to touch his fortune. The war begins, and the profits tremble. By 1930, tensions between the old Sicilian bosses had escalated into open warfare. Masuria on one side, Maranzano on the other, two aging monarchs clinging to old-world codes. Soldiers were gunned down in restaurants, thrown into alleys, or disappeared entirely. Businesses that once paid protection were now terrified to open their doors. Bootlegging trucks stopped running. Gambling dens shuttered early. Every drop in revenue struck Luciano like a warning bell. He had spent years turning vice into organized commerce. Now, the war threatened to unravel everything with a single poorly timed bullet. Worse, both bosses demanded loyalty and tribute, as if loyalty alone could keep profits alive. Luciano had never feared violence. He feared disruptions to revenue. This war, if left unchecked, could bankrupt the future he was designing. Assassination attempts. A strategist under fire. Luciano's rise had made him valuable, but it also made him a target. As the conflict intensified, both factions saw Luciano as a threat, or an asset to steal. One night, Luciano walked out of a Manhattan club only to find a gunman stepping from the shadows. The shot missed by inches. Another attempt came disguised as a friendly meeting, where he barely escaped a knife aimed at his ribs. Stories spread of a car bomb wired beneath a vehicle he'd switched at the last second. Each attempt sharpened Luciano's understanding. This was no longer a street conflict. It was a purge. And if he died, the syndicate he was building would crumble without ever reaching its potential. So he moved smarter. He changed routes, changed cars, changed times. He met allies only in locations chosen moments before arrival. He adopted silent routines designed to confuse watchers. Every step he took became a calculated risk, not in fear, but in preservation of the empire he was constructing. Shifting alliances, a chessboard of blood. What made the Castellamarese War so dangerous was not only the violence, but the uncertainty. Allies today could be assassins tomorrow. A rumor whispered in a cafe could turn into an execution. Luciano understood that alliances in a war like this could not be built on promises or traditions. They had to be built on mutual benefit. He met secretly with soldiers from both sides, gauging their motivations. He offered reassurance to those who feared Masuria's rigidity and opportunity to those who feared Maranzano's tyranny. His ability to read people, their insecurities, their ambitions, allowed him to remain trusted by both factions without fully committing to either. Where others fought blindly, Luciano negotiated pathways through the chaos, holding his financial structure together like a man sealing cracks in a dam. Political corruption, the hidden shield. While gunfire echoed in the alleys, Luciano turned to one of his most powerful weapons: political influence. Through Frank Costello, he ensured police raids were minimized on his profitable operations. Judges were quietly persuaded to overlook certain arrests. City officials who once dealt with Mafia now found Luciano's offers more appealing and more profitable. Corruption became a shield against the war. While rivals bled each other dry, Luciano's gambling houses still counted chips, his brothels still made nightly earnings, and his bootlegging routes continued operating under the protection of strategically placed favors. Violence might win battles, but influence preserved income. The hidden war within the war. The Castellamarese conflict raged in the streets, but Luciano was fighting a second war in silence, the war to prevent collapse of the financial system he built. Every day brought new crises: a bootlegging driver murdered on a route, a gambling den shaken down by rival soldiers, a numbers runner kidnapped for information, a union contact threatened by shifting allegiances. Luciano responded to each not with revenge, but with containment. He relocated operations overnight, shifted money to new pipelines, transferred managers to safer territories, replaced compromised personnel with men less exposed to the unfolding war. He preserved profit where others focused on bodies. The turning point: understanding the real risk. Weeks turned into months and Luciano began to see the war differently. It wasn't simply Mafia versus Maranzano. It was old thinking versus new thinking. The old bosses believed power came from titles and fear. Luciano believed power came from organization and revenue. The longer the war lasted, the clearer it became: the old world was destroying the new industry he was building. Every death, every lost dollar, every disrupted route reinforced one truth: if he wanted to protect the future, he had to stop the men destroying it. The resolve to eliminate obstacles. Luciano had no desire to become a warlord. He wanted a boardroom, not a battlefield. But watching the financial damage unfold taught him a hard lesson. Some obstacles could not be negotiated with. They had to be removed. Mafia refused modernization. Maranzano refused partnership. Both were threats not just to Luciano personally, but to the entire financial ecosystem he envisioned. Eliminating them was not ambition. It was risk management. The war had sharpened Luciano's instincts, refined his focus, and pushed him toward the most dangerous decisions of his life, decisions that would reshape the Mafia forever. A strategist forged in fire. By the time the Castellamarese war neared its end, Luciano was no longer just a rising figure. He had become the strategic mind capable of turning violence into opportunity and chaos into structure. He didn't survive the war. He mastered it, protecting his fortune, analyzing every risk, and preparing to build something the old bosses could never imagine. The hidden war behind the public conflict was not about bullets. It was about preserving the industry. And Luciano would act soon, not to win the war but to end it. 4 years, Lucky Luciano had engineered the closest thing the criminal underworld had ever seen to perfection. A syndicate built on logic, structure, and near-invisible coordination. It was a machine with many parts, each designed to protect the whole. Money flowed upward, orders flowed downward, and silence sealed every crack. But as the machine grew, so did the noise around it. Law enforcement, once blind to the scale of organized crime, began noticing patterns. Coordinated strikes, synchronized operations, revenue streams that seemed eerily consistent across different cities. Newspapers whispered about industrialized vice. Prosecutors discussed national coordination. Politicians demanded answers. The invisible empire Luciano built was becoming visible. The Law Awakens. The first sign of real danger didn't come from a raid or an arrest. It came from a shift in attention. District attorneys, journalists, and special prosecutors began focusing not on individual crimes, but on systems. Why were gambling houses operating with similar structures? Why were prostitution arrests followed by the same names and addresses? Why did certain businesses thrive despite constant scrutiny? Patterns, coordination, organization. The public didn't know the word mafia yet, not in any meaningful sense, but they knew something larger was operating. And behind every pattern, every whisper, every rumor, one name seemed to echo: Luciano. He had become the mind behind the machine. Now he was becoming the face of it. The pressure builds. Dewey's crusade. Thomas E. Dewey was unlike any prosecutor the Mafia had ever faced. He didn't chase individual gangsters or isolated crimes. He studied charts, phone logs, financial discrepancies, whispers from brothels, patterns in gambling arrests. He treated crime like data, and data like a map leading straight to one man. Dewey launched a full-scale offensive: raids, interrogations, surveillance, subpoenas. His office worked night and day, peeling back the layers of Luciano's empire. To Dewey, Luciano wasn't a suspect. He was the system itself. And systems could be dismantled. The cracks begin to show. The first cracks didn't appear in Luciano's structure. They appeared in people. Fear is contagious. Pressure changes loyalties. Attention exposes weaknesses. Some brothel managers panicked under questioning. Some union contacts feared federal prosecution. Some low-level associates realized they had more to gain talking than staying silent. These were not trusted lieutenants. They were the edges of the network, the workers who never met Luciano but knew their earnings fed a larger structure. They didn't break Omerta out of disloyalty. They broke because they were never taught its weight. They weren't soldiers. They weren't mafia. They were employees of a system they barely understood. Employees talk. And talk becomes testimony. Internal betrayals, the poison of ambition inside Luciano's circle. Another threat grew, the ambitions of Vito Genovese. Genovese had always wanted the top seat. He masked it as loyalty, but his eyes burned with quiet envy. As law enforcement zeroed in on Luciano, Genovese sensed opportunity. He distanced himself strategically. He whispered about caution, death, and legal trouble. He implied that Luciano's modern ideas had brought too much scrutiny. The unspoken message was clear. Luciano had made the mafia too big, too bold, too exposed. If Luciano fell, Genovese was ready to replace him. Luciano saw the signs, the delayed responses, the evasive answers, the newly formed alliances, but he had bigger problems than internal politics. The government wasn't just circling anymore. It was closing in. The invisible fortune becomes visible threat. The irony of Luciano's downfall is that he was never charged for the crimes that made him rich. Not gambling. Not narcotics. Not racketeering. Not corruption. Instead, he was targeted for prostitution, the least glamorous, least strategic, and least powerful arm of his empire. But prostitution had one fatal flaw. It involved dozens of workers with nothing to lose. Dewey squeezed them. They talked. And suddenly Luciano's empire, no matter how sophisticated, looked vulnerable. The empire that hid its money could not hide the people who earned it. The psychological shift. From architect to target, Luciano had spent his life mastering psychology, reading faces, controlling rooms, shaping alliances. But now the psychology turned against him. The media painted him as a puppet master, a crime king, a nationwide syndicate director. He had built an empire too perfect to detect. Now perfection became the proof. The commission made the mafia look organized. Lansky made the numbers look coordinated. Siegel's operations made profits flow predictably. To law enforcement, predictability looked like conspiracy. Luciano watched newspapers describe him as a phantom general commanding an invisible army. The public devoured the story. Prosecutors amplified it. Suddenly, the man who built the most discreet system ever designed became a symbol of open criminality. He could no longer hide behind lieutenants. He could no longer disappear into backrooms. Every move was a headline. The walls tightened. Emotion versus control. Luciano never panicked, but he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his calculations. Vulnerability. He saw the fear in the eyes of his men. He sensed hesitation in their voices. He noticed pauses where loyalty used to be automatic. He had not mismanaged his empire. He had simply perfected it so well that it demanded attention. And attention was poison. Luciano was no longer the invisible CEO of a hidden corporation. He was the most hunted man in New York. The empire outgrows the builder. The deeper tragedy was one Luciano understood too late. The systems he built continued functioning even as the system tried to consume him. Profits flowed. Unions stayed controlled. Gambling networks ran as usual. The commission held meetings. The empire didn't collapse. It simply moved forward without him. Luciano realized the awful truth. When a system becomes perfect, it no longer needs its architect. But the world still punishes him for building it. The fall begins when Dewey finally made his move, arresting Luciano and launching the trial that would define both their careers. Luciano remained calm, but even he felt the shift. This was not a fight about evidence. It was a fight about symbolism. The government needed a victory. The public needed a villain. And Luciano, the man who made crime modern, had become the perfect target. He had built an empire of shadows. Now the light was coming for him. And the fall had only just begun. The courtroom was not a battlefield Luciano could control. There were no alliances to forge, no silent negotiations to maneuver, no territory to retreat to. Here, in the blinding lights of press cameras and the cold gaze of the public, the empire he built through whispers and shadows was dragged into the open. And at the center of it all stood Thomas E. Dewey, the prosecutor determined to turn Luciano's hidden fortune into the very chain that would bind him. The morality crusade begins from the moment Dewey stepped into the case. He framed the trial not as a legal proceeding, but as a moral reckoning. He wanted the jury, the newspapers, and the American public to believe that Lucky Luciano wasn't just a criminal. He was the chief architect of a national vice machine that preyed on vulnerability. Dewey was a master of optics. His questions were sharp, his tone righteous, his strategy immaculate. He spoke of women exploited, money siphoned from the shadows, coordinated brothel networks that mirrored business franchises, and a mastermind who never dirtied his hands because he controlled everything with efficiency and distance. The courtroom audience was captivated. The press had its villain. Luciano had become the face of industrialized sin. Financial records. The invisible fortune made visible. Luciano had always believed his fortune was untraceable. After all, it existed in cash, in coded ledgers, in the pockets of intermediaries, and in the quiet discipline of revenue routes no one outside the organization understood. But Dewey didn't need precise figures. He only needed patterns. He brought in seized notebooks from brothels, payment slips found in raided gambling dens, coded messages between collectors and managers, and testimony from accountants who understood how money should flow, and how it flowed in Luciano's world. Individually, none of these records proved much. But together, Dewey arranged them into a mosaic of financial coordination so vast, the jury could only conclude one thing: this wasn't accidental. This wasn't scattered crime. This was a system, and Luciano was its architect. The irony was painful. The very structure Luciano built to hide his wealth became the blueprint prosecutors used to expose it. Witnesses bought by fear and freedom. Luciano understood human psychology better than anyone, but prison changed the equations. Dewey pressured the weakest links in the prostitution network: women with children, immigrants facing deportation, addicts, workers terrified of the underworld's reputation. He offered protection. He offered mercy. He offered escape. One by one they testified. Some exaggerated. Some repeated rumors they barely understood. Some conflated Luciano with the entire chain of command. But Dewey didn't need accuracy. He needed consistency. The testimonies formed a narrative that the public swallowed whole. Luciano authorized the brothel system. Luciano received cuts from every district. Luciano punished disobedience. Luciano was the invisible hand behind every vice dollar. Luciano sat still, watching the distortion of his empire take shape in front of 12 strangers who would decide his future. He was not surprised they talked. But he felt something close to betrayal, not from them but from the system he designed, which required so many expendable people who never learned silence. The defense versus the narrative. Luciano's lawyers argued diligently. They pointed out that he wasn't present at brothels, he didn't know most witnesses, no direct financial ties existed, and no written orders could be linked to him. But Dewey had crafted a trial built on implication, not proof. The jury wasn't evaluating Luciano's actions. It was evaluating the idea of Luciano. And ideas, once corrupted, are impossible to defend. Luciano watches his empire turn against him. The emotional tension in the courtroom was subtle but devastating. Luciano, the man who once controlled meetings with a nod, who built alliances by reading men's hearts, who engineered the most disciplined underworld structure in history, now sat powerless as his life's work was weaponized. Every piece of evidence, every witness, every headline said the same thing: your empire made you untouchable. Now it makes you guilty. He didn't show anger. He didn't lash out. Instead, his expression suggested a man realizing that no matter how well he hid the money, nothing could hide the scale. The empire had grown too big, too efficient, too coordinated. And efficiency leaves footprints. The sentence, "A king falls in silence." The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Dewey delivered a closing argument dripping with moral victory, painting Luciano as a national threat, a criminal CEO, a corrupter of America's women and America's cities. The jury found him guilty on dozens of counts. When the judge pronounced his sentence, 30 to 50 years, the courtroom gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously. Dewey's career was instantly cemented. And Luciano, for the first time in his life, could no longer calculate a next move. He nodded once, accepting it with the calm of a man who understood exactly what had happened. Money could buy loyalty. Money could buy silence. Money could buy protection. But money could not buy invisibility once the world decided to look. The climax of a perfect paradox. Luciano had built the modern mafia through organization, discipline, and industrial-scale economics. Now that same structure proved he was its mastermind. His hidden fortune, the invisible river flowing beneath America, became the very evidence that destroyed his freedom. The architect of organized crime had been undone by the perfection of his own design. Prison was never part of Lucky Luciano's blueprint, yet when the gates closed behind him, something remarkable happened. The empire he built didn't collapse. It adapted. It expanded. It kept generating money with the same rhythmic precision he had designed. Luciano, sitting behind bars, discovered a strange truth about the syndicate he created. He was no longer necessary for its survival. But he was still its center of gravity. A mind that would not be confined inside Clinton Correctional Facility. Luciano quickly realized that confinement was physical, not psychological. Word traveled fast that he was there. Guards watched him with curiosity. Inmates watched him with respect. And within weeks he became a quiet stabilizing force. The same role he played on the streets now translated into prison dynamics. He wasn't giving orders. He was giving structure. Men came to him with disputes. He resolved them calmly, with the authority of someone who understood human nature better than anyone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He simply listened, and made decisions that kept tension from boiling over. Even imprisoned, he behaved like a chairman holding meetings in a new, harsher boardroom. The commission continues. Luciano's masterpiece lives on. If Luciano worried about losing relevance, the commission quickly proved otherwise. The governing body he created, the corporate skeleton of American organized crime, functioned exactly as he intended, collaboratively, efficiently, and independently. Meetings continued. Territories remained stable. Profits flowed across cities with the same predictable rhythm. Luciano's rules outlived his presence. No boss could seize absolute power. Disputes were settled through negotiation, not bloodshed. Revenue streams were protected through collective interest. The Mafia, once brittle and prone to civil war, now operated with the confidence of a self-sustaining enterprise. His idea had become a living organism, one that fed itself even when the architect was locked away. Coded communications. Influence in the shadows. Though he avoided overt leadership, Luciano still influenced strategic decisions through coded conversations during visits with trusted associates. Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and others met him under the guise of social visits. Their conversations were neutral on the surface, about sports, weather, family, but beneath each casual line lay subtle messages. A change in tone meant approval. A pause meant rejection. A stray observation meant warning. Luciano communicated like a man who understood the dangers of clarity. He never issued explicit commands. He never acknowledged specific operations. But his allies understood him well enough to interpret a raised eyebrow as a shift in strategy. The brilliance of his leadership was that he no longer needed to lead directly. The money still moves even from a cell. Luciano could sense the movement of capital like a pulse beneath the floor. Gambling revenues continued to climb. Union racketeering remained lucrative. Narcotics pipelines expanded cautiously. Prostitution routes refined their logistics. He heard details and fragments. A casino opening in Miami, cooperation with Chicago on labor deals, political figures quietly exchanging favors, reliable payments still reaching the right hands. The machine he built didn't stall. It accelerated. Luciano often reflected on the irony. He had engineered a system so efficient that it rendered its creator unnecessary. That realization cut with two edges: pride and melancholy. Residual power, respect without presence. Even locked away, Luciano carried more influence than many free men. His name was spoken in backrooms with reverence. Young soldiers who had never met him studied his methods. Bosses governed using rules he drafted. Delegates sat in commission meetings aware that the entire structure existed because one man saw the future clearly enough to build it. Luciano no longer commanded fear. He commanded continuity. His authority wasn't loud, it was structural. He didn't need to be present for his presence to be felt. But power without touch becomes its own sentence. With each passing year, Luciano felt the emotional distance growing. He could influence decisions, but he could not shape them with the same sharp instinct he once had. He could watch the machine run, but he could not feel its gears turning beneath his hands. It was like watching someone else drive the car he had designed. The commission made the Mafia stronger, but it also made it less dependent on him. Luciano understood the paradox. He had created a system meant to survive any single man. Now that system was proving it could survive without him. The industry moves forward. Without the architect by the mid-1930s and into the 1940s, Luciano recognized the bittersweet truth. The Mafia's success proved his genius, but that same success slowly erased his necessity. The empire he built wasn't waiting for him. It was evolving without him. It was thriving without him. Profits grew. Territories expanded. New leaders rose through the ranks. The architect remained respected, honored, but removed. A king still named but no longer needed. Luciano's power behind bars was real, but it was symbolic more than operational. His ideas shaped the Mafia's present. His legacy shaped its future. Yet he remained a man watching the shadow of his own empire move like a distant tide. His influence endured. His authority echoed. But the world he built had learned to stand without him. And that was the greatest proof of his brilliance, and the deepest wound his pride ever suffered. When Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, he was sent away as a criminal, but he arrived as a king without a kingdom. The ship that carried him across the Atlantic might as well have carried away his empire. In America, the machine he built continued humming. In Italy, silence greeted him. Wealth still surrounded him, reputation still followed him, but the throne he once commanded was now an ocean away. Italy was supposed to feel like home. Instead, it felt like exile. A legend returning to a foreign home, Naples welcomed him with curiosity and unease. To some, he was a returning folk hero. To others, he was an Americanized outsider whose ideas didn't belong in the old-world mafia. Luciano walked the cobbled streets absorbing the differences. The slower tempo, the rigid traditions, the hierarchy rooted in heritage rather than strategy. These men respected bloodlines, not blueprints. Power here was inherited, not engineered. And crime, as practiced in post-war Italy, lacked the corporate polish of Luciano's New York empire. He tried to insert himself into the Sicilian and Neapolitan networks, but their operations felt primitive compared to the system he had once overseen. Luciano had evolved, the old mafia had not. Trying to rebuild influence from afar, even from exile, Luciano refused to abandon the idea of influence. He wrote letters, hosted visitors, and used coded conversations with old allies to stay informed about American affairs. His network still trusted him, still admired him, and still referred to him when tensions rose. But distance changes everything. Advice became interpretation. Interpretation became variation. Variation became independence. Luciano found that he could no longer shape events, only react to distorted echoes of them. Events that once pivoted on his judgment now evolved without him. His lieutenants still came for reassurance, but they no longer needed direction. Luciano was still rich, still respected, still legendary. But power had slipped through his fingers like water. The narcotics pipeline, a dangerous return to relevance. When the post-war narcotics trade began expanding, Luciano saw an opportunity. His old connections, Sicilian suppliers, Marseille refiners, Cuban intermediaries, positioned him as a potential architect of a new international pipeline. It was lucrative. It was global. It was the kind of system that demanded a strategist like him. Luciano became an informal consultant for traffickers moving heroin from Turkey to Italy, from Italy to New York. His involvement was subtle: suggestions, introductions, quiet approvals. He never handled shipments directly, but his fingerprints were visible in the pipeline's logic. And yet, even here he encountered a painful shift. In America he had set the rules. In Italy he followed the shifting winds of younger, hungrier players. He still influenced narcotics trafficking, but not decisively. The new generation treated him like a respected elder, wise, experienced, and outdated. They wanted his guidance, not his leadership. Wealth followed him. Authority did not. The emotional cost of power lost. Luciano had always believed that money created freedom. But in exile, money created frustration. He could pay for comfort, apartments, tailored suits, elegant dinners, but he could not buy proximity to the empire he built. He could support people, reward loyalty, maintain relationships, but he could not command outcomes the way he once had. His rules were still respected, but no longer enforced by his voice. He realized something no amount of wealth could disguise. Power is not money. Power is presence. And presence was the one thing exile stole from him completely. Watching the empire evolve without him through visitors and letters, Luciano heard stories of the American Mafia's evolution. New bosses rising, new industries emerging, new threats appearing, new profits flowing. Everything he created, the commission, the revenue streams, the alliances, still existed. His architecture remained intact, but the architects of the new era were different men. He was proud of their success. But pride was a thin shield against irrelevance. Every success they achieved reminded him of what he no longer controlled. Every decision they made reminded him of the distance that shaped his exile. The machine he built no longer needed its builder. Philosophical transformation. Accepting the limits as the years passed, Luciano shifted from strategist to philosopher. He spent hours sitting in cafes, cigarette in hand, watching people live ordinary lives untouched by the shadows he once ruled. He thought about money, power, loyalty, betrayal, the ingredients of his rise and the ghosts of his downfall. He realized that the empire he built had been both his masterpiece and his prison. It made him wealthy beyond measure. It made him visible to the wrong enemies. It pushed him to decisions that reshaped history and ended his freedom. He had wanted permanence. He had achieved it. But permanence did not include him. Luciano began to understand that power is always temporary, even the power of empire makers. Money can buy protection, silence, comfort, but not belonging, not return, not control. The final acceptance in his last years, living quietly in Naples, Luciano accepted the paradox of his life. He had built something too big to destroy. He had built something too stable to require him. He had built an empire that lived, even as he stood outside it. On January 26, 1962, Luciano died at Naples airport after meeting a producer interested in making a film about his life. Even at the end he tried to control the narrative. But life, like empire, always escapes the hands of the architect. His wealth survived. His legend survived. But his throne belonged to history, not to him. Lucky Luciano's endgame was not poverty or ruin. It was wealth without a throne, power without presence, and a legacy that outlived the man who designed it. Lucky Luciano's true legacy is not the money he made, the power he held, or even the empire he built during his lifetime. His legacy is the blueprint he left behind, a structural, psychological, and strategic model that reshaped global organized crime forever. Before Luciano, the underworld was a fractured world of tribal loyalties and spontaneous violence. After Luciano, it became an industry. His hidden fortune did not lie only in illicit cash. It lay in the systems he crafted, the ideas he pioneered, and the organizational logic that spread far beyond New York. Luciano didn't just change the Mafia, he changed how crime itself thought. A corporate model for the underworld. Luciano's greatest innovation was importing the logic of corporate America into the criminal world. He looked at Fortune 500 companies and understood instinctively that structure was the key to efficiency. He brought that same structure to organized crime: delegation of authority, profit-sharing models, regional oversight, standardized revenue systems, specialized departments for gambling, unions, narcotics, and protection. Before Luciano, no criminal organization had ever operated with this kind of internal architecture. After him, every syndicate did. Whether in Sicily, Hong Kong, Moscow, Mexico, or Brazil, modern crime groups mirror Luciano's design: decentralized, profit-focused, and resilient to leadership changes. He unintentionally provided a formula that became universal, a way for illegal industries to outlive their leaders and withstand government attacks. Luciano created the first truly scalable criminal enterprise. The Commission, a governance model that endured. Of all his innovations, none shaped the future more than the Commission, a governing council that replaced the archaic boss of all bosses model with collective decision-making. The Commission prevented internal wars, settled disputes like a board of directors, coordinated national strategies, stabilized revenue streams, kept individual bosses from becoming tyrants. The structure allowed organized crime to survive the deaths, arrests, and betrayals that would have destroyed any other system. Luciano understood that institutions, not individuals, create longevity. Decades after his exile and death, the Commission continued to exist, quietly guiding American organized crime, resolving disputes, allocating territories, and preserving order. Even when law enforcement cracked down, the structure remained functional because it wasn't built around a single personality. It was built around Luciano's philosophy of shared power. It was governance disguised as criminality, a parliament in the shadows. Global syndicates follow the blueprint. What Luciano created in America echoed across the world. The Sicilian Mafia adopted commission-style leadership to mediate disputes and coordinate international heroin routes. The Japanese Yakuza strengthened corporate-like hierarchies inspired by his decentralization model. The Russian Mafia embraced flexible, network-based operations instead of rigid hierarchies. Latin American cartels adopted Luciano's principles of delegation and specialization, allowing them to expand across continents. Triads modernized financial operations and political bribery using strategies ironically similar to Luciano's. The global underworld evolved into a landscape where crime flowed like multinational business, because Luciano had proven it was possible. His impact was not cultural. It was operational. The psychological wealth he left behind. Luciano's understanding of people was as influential as his structural reforms. He recognized that controlling a criminal empire required mastery of psychology, not brute force. He taught future generations that fear must be targeted, not reckless loyalty must be earned, not demanded silence must be incentivized, not merely enforced cooperation must be profitable, not emotional leadership must be predictable, not impulsive. This shift changed everything. Violence became strategic. Punishment became calculated. Trust became transactional. His psychological blueprint created a new kind of criminal leader. One who used incentives where others used intimidation, one who saw men not as soldiers but as assets. Luciano's wealth was not merely financial. It was intellectual. The hidden fortune that outlived him. By the time of his exile, Luciano understood that the true value of his empire was not in the cash hidden in envelopes or the skimmed profits from gambling houses. His hidden fortune was the structure he created, the alliances he built, the rules he laid down, the governance he implemented, the psychological logic he embedded in every operation. This was wealth that couldn't be seized in a raid, documented in a ledger, or confiscated by any judge. It was wealth woven into the bones of organized crime itself. Even when he sat alone in Naples, far from his kingdom, his fortune kept growing, not in his pockets but in the minds and methods of men he would never meet. A legacy larger than the man. Lucky Luciano's name became synonymous with the birth of modern organized crime. But his legacy is more nuanced. He didn't just build an empire, he built the instruction manual for empires. He didn't just accumulate wealth, he created systems that generated wealth long after he lost control of them. He didn't just change the Mafia, he changed the logic of criminal enterprise worldwide. His system became his immortality. Lucky Luciano died without a throne, but not without a kingdom. His greatest wealth was never the money he earned, it was the industry he left behind. Lucky Luciano's story is not simply the chronicle of a gangster who rose through violence or intimidation. It is the story of a man who redefined the very nature of power, a strategist who looked at the scattered fragments of America's underworld and saw, not chaos but potential. He transformed a loose collection of hustlers, racketeers, and feuding clans into a coordinated, multi-layered criminal industry. He turned crime into commerce. He turned vice into infrastructure. He turned the Mafia into a corporation. And in doing so he changed America. Luciano's genius was not that he ran rackets more ruthlessly than others. It was that he understood the psychology of systems. He knew how people behaved under pressure, how ambition twisted into betrayal, how loyalty could be nurtured or bought, and how money flowed more efficiently through cooperation than through bloodshed. He replaced brute force with structure, vendetta with negotiation, tradition with innovation. He created a model so effective that it survived long after he no longer had the power to enforce it. The duality behind the legacy. Lucky Luciano represents one of the most compelling dualities in American history. He was a criminal and a visionary, a lawbreaker and a system builder, a man of shadows and an architect of order. His innovation stabilized the underworld at a time when constant violence threatened to tear it apart. He didn't eliminate crime, he industrialized it. He didn't reduce immorality, he monetized it. He brought efficiency to illegal industries, applying corporate logic to prostitution, gambling, narcotics, and unions in ways that mirrored legitimate capitalism more than traditional mafia codes. This duality is at the heart of his legacy. The same brilliance that made him wealthy made him dangerous. The same structure that brought prosperity brought scrutiny. The same empire that empowered him exposed him. His downfall was not hypocrisy, it was inevitability. The hidden fortune that defined an era. Luciano's greatest fortune was not stacks of cash hidden in safe houses or envelopes delivered through back alleys. Those were temporary, replaceable, and destined to scatter with time. His real fortune was structural, embedded in the blueprint of a system he left behind. He created a national network of interconnected criminal enterprises, a governing body that survived decades of arrests and assassinations, a psychological code that shaped how criminals viewed loyalty and silence, a decentralized corporate model that influenced organized crime across continents. This was wealth that could not be seized or counted. Wealth that didn't exist on paper but changed the economic and political geography of the country. Wealth that flowed through cities long after Luciano was gone, shaping labor markets, law enforcement strategies, and even American pop culture. The men who followed him lived off the interest of his ideas. The emotional truth behind the empire, yet behind the brilliance, behind the influence, behind the system that made him immortal, there remained the human being, the boy from the Lower East Side who grew up understanding hunger, fear, and the fragile weight of survival. Luciano did not strive for power simply to dominate. He sought it to create stability in a world that offered none. He sought order in a life shaped by disorder. He sought permanence in a reality where everything felt temporary. He built an empire because he needed one, emotionally and strategically. But that empire, once built, evolved beyond his grasp. By the end of his life, he was a man watching the world he designed operate smoothly without him, a king without a throne, a founder whose institution had grown too large to return to his hands. His final years reveal the ultimate irony. Luciano achieved immortality not by remaining in control, but by creating something that no longer required him. The myth and the man history remembers him as the father of organized crime, the mastermind behind the commission, the innovator who turned vice into industry. But the myth is incomplete without the man, a strategist shaped by poverty, sharpened by survival, and driven by the desire to bring order to chaos. He was both the product of his environment and the designer of a new one. He was both celebrated and feared, both powerful and painfully human. Lucky Luciano's legacy is not the violence associated with the Mafia but the structure that allowed it to endure. He turned crime into a corporation. He built an empire from shadows. And he left behind a blueprint that changed American history. In the end, the myth made him larger than life, but the man behind it built a system far larger than himself.